how do you look back to your proudest moments of your past and say, in those proudest moments, what were you doing? And who were the people who were benefiting from the work that you were doing? And what was the impact that you were having on their lives? Because once you have those two ingredients, who were you serving and what was the impact, you can very quickly flip that around into a simple purpose statement or even a question. Because you can say, how might I create more of this impact for these people? Because once you have a question like that, you can then apply it to your own life and say, what am I doing today that answers that question? And what am I doing today that absolutely does not? And that then raises a question of based on that, what should you start, what should you stop, and what should you continue? So for myself, I had a very similar experience of looking at the work that I've been doing and saying, what really gets me excited? When I look back on the projects that we've taken on, clients we've worked with, and when I look at what I might want to do in the future, I have to start asking that question of what were my proudest moments? And all of my proudest moments point to these times where it wasn't just about designing a cool solution, but it was actually working with a team or with a company and seeing a dramatic cultural change, where you saw a different kind of conversation happening with these warm, kind companies being developed and teams being developed. And that's what really gets me excited. And so then the question becomes, how can I do more of that? And that leads to the portfolio of work that I take on these days.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
The joke that I like to tell is that if you were to read my resume, it looks like somebody went dumpster diving the shred bin at an employment agency and just taped together the scraps. I started out in college. I went to college in New York City at NYU, a tiny program there called Gallatin, which is individualized study. Study whatever the heck you want, as long as you can pull a thesis together at the end. And my thesis was actually it was a cross between political science and a little bit of statistics and a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of religion. But it was looking at the impact of 1980s cartoon shows on the moral and political attitudes of 18 to 24-year-olds around the 2000 election. Wow. It was called Optimus Prime and the Search for a Reaganomic Morality. So what the heck kind of job do you get when you cartoon philosophy? I actually started while I was in college working in the magazine industry, where I was doing photo editing and serving as a photo assistant in a number of photo studios, and then graduated college around the time that the dot-com bubble had burst. So there was not really a promising future for the magazine industry. Advertising revenue was down, everything looked scary. So I looked for what else am I passionate about? Well, at the time, I actually watched a ton of C-SPAN. It's a very nerdy thing to be into, but I followed politics like most people follow sports. And so I was able to parlay that into a role with a company called the College Board. The company owns the SAT and the AP program. And I started out there as a membership associate, both working on helping them build conferences, but also helping them do legislative advocacy work in D.C. So pulling together blue ribbon panels of Pulitzer Prize winners and senators and congressmen and that sort of stuff to change education policy. And I loved politics until I started working with people in politics and see just how slow it is to get any kind of change happening. And so I wanted to jump from there to something where I could have more direct impact. So I joined their marketing and branding team and led a whole series of projects in there, everything from sort of textbooks and study guides on the editorial side to working to rebrand the SAT, where we really took the question that was posed to us, which was, how can we update the look and feel of the SAT? And we did some qualitative research with students and were able to uncover that, you know what, no one cares about updating the look and feel. Anybody who's applying to college is terrified. They're full of anxiety. So the real question for us was, instead of thinking about look and feel, can we instead think about how can we remove anxiety from the college application process? And so that approach was sort of my first introduction to formal design research and the impact of sort of human-centered design. And so that got me sort of thinking about, well, what do I want to do with my future? While I was working at the College Board, I was doing a lot of drawing in my spare time because I love art, and I was selling some drawings in galleries in New York. And I had friends who would have little web startups, and they would ask me to do graphic design for them, or then ultimately do interaction design. And so I had this sort of design thing in my head. And so, of course, I did the logical next step, which was I went and got an MBA. Because when you want to be a designer, go get a business degree. But I went to Stanford for business school, which was a hugely transformative experience for me. But I went there largely because of the connection they have with the D School, the Hasso-Plattner Institute for Design, which was created by David Kelly, IDEO's founder. And in working there, taking classes there, I met a business partner of mine, Emily Ma, and she and I started doing consulting projects on the side while we were in school, sort of applying business and design to the work that we were doing. And we had a couple professors who loved us and wanted to keep us going in our fledgling business. And so they kept us on as teaching fellows at the university while we were trying to build this business. And so we were rethinking how classes were taught in business schools while also working with this neuroeconomist named Baba Shiv, who was an incredible inspiration, and helping him to think through how he can apply learnings from neuroscience to helping people design better products and services. And this is where I probably first got bitten by the bug to study behavioral science, which is why I'm now known for my catchphrase around IDEO, which is studies show. I tend to quote studies freaking constantly. So that's basically my arc through Stanford. And then at Stanford, Emily actually lost her visa and had to go back to Canada. And at the time, I had some friends from IDEO. Emily herself was an ex-IDEOer. And so they just said, hey, you ever think about coming and working here? And came over to IDEO, and every project I took on at IDEO was a service design project where we're thinking through how can we rethink the service experience, whether that's in call centers or airlines or sports arenas. And ultimately, that leads to both designing for users as well as designing for employees. And that's where I started getting this topic of organizational change really heavily.
Okay.
And that's what I anchor in now. Sorry for a very long response.
No, that was phenomenal. And it raises so many questions, which is awesome. I want to talk about NYU and that decision to go in with a major where you can kind of do whatever you want. It's so interesting that, the thread that ends with is finding purpose, because, it seems to me, one, at 18 to know that you wanted to do that is kind of amazing. Or did you? That's one question that comes up for me, because I remember being in college and I remember thinking that, when I look back at it, there were a handful of majors that led to a handful of jobs. And if I didn't choose from the options in front of me, I was going to be screwed. So that raises numerous questions about, one, having worked on education policy of all things, what do you think about our current education system? Do you think it works? How would you change it? And why do you think that we can get two people who come through the same system who produce such drastically different results? And I'll mention, the context for that. My sister and I both went to Berkeley. I happened to graduate around the same time you did from college, so you can imagine what that was like. She became a doctor. I got fired from every job I had. So you being somebody who has studied education policy and went in with this very unique sort of experience in college, what do you have to say about all that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we have an entire studio within IDEO that's focused on education. It's called Design for Learning. And it's been really amazing to see some of the work that comes out there, because I don't think anyone has an answer for how to fix the education system. There are so many issues that have direct impact on it. But some of the solutions they started to look at for how do we help students not only stick through high school, but make it to college, and then once they make it to college, actually stick through college, has to do with this notion of purpose, of trying to figure out what gives you greater meaning in your life, and how do you stick with it. Design for Learning actually built out a project called the Purpose Project, which is a free web tool for teens to use, where they can use that to uncover their own purpose and take action against it. And then we've been doing similar work, of course, with IDEO and a course called The Power of Purpose. Mm-hmm. You apply this to people and teams. So your broader question, how can we help people find what they want in school? I think there's one thing of schools helping people see that it's not just about the grades and it's not just about the logical next step, but it's about finding the things that give you passion, that will help you to tap into your energy and help you do the best work of your life. Because I think that's what we all want in our jobs, is something that gives us a little deeper meaning and a little deeper drive. Because I'm sure that you being fired from job after job was not because you are terrible at working, but probably because of many other factors. But if there were a way of tapping into more of what you wanted to achieve and aligning that with your business or with each of your jobs, there's more likelihood that you'd be successful.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I almost always think that what happens in those situations is a mismatch of talent and environment.
Yeah, amen. And I think the environment question is a really big one.
Yeah.
Which, I don't think the way we set up most standard things is right for every single person. I feel like this is a very sort of American way of talking, so I feel bad about that idea that everything needs to be customized and individualized, but I do think there's some truth to it. I think you feel more ownership over your life when you have greater levels of control, right? This comes back to Dan Pink and sort of the autonomy, purpose, and mastery.
Yeah.
The three things people need. I think that's incredibly true, no matter whether it's education or jobs or anything else.
Mm-hmm. Two things come from this. Do you think that when somebody is 18 years old, they have enough self-awareness and enough life experience to say, okay, I think I can figure out what my purpose is? Because I think the thing that also came for me from age and from experience and from input was a number of data points that I would have never been able to get without age and experience. Yeah,
I think that's true. But I also imagine that you don't have just one purpose.
Yeah.
You probably have a professional purpose, and you've got personal purpose, and you've got local purpose and community purpose and societal purpose and global purpose. I mean, all these things tend to nest. I'm reminded of, we were working on one purpose project, and there was a woman that I was interviewing where we were trying to define, why does the company exist and what motivates and inspires people to do their jobs. And I asked this woman, well, why do you come to work every day? And she said, so that I can feed my 3 kids. Well, okay, there's no corporate purpose that's ever going to take the place of that. So then the question is, if you're defining a team's purpose or a company's purpose, how can you find the thing that aligns with the other impact that she wants to have in her life? You're never going to replace feed my kids 3 times a day. Like, it's just crazy.
Mm-hmm. So I want to come back to this idea of purpose and actually walk through sort of a framework for it. But before we do that, I want to talk about this idea of human-centered design and talk about how that applies to our lives. How do we do that with our own work as a creative person who, for example, runs a podcast, writes books, and does all these stuff? How does that apply to me? And how do I actually incorporate it into my work?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually think there's a lot of what we do that you probably naturally integrate.
Sure.
We mostly try and be incredibly clear about the phases that we're moving through, because we find that we're more efficient in doing our work when we can operate in one way at a time. But the biggest thing that we'd look at would be, if we take the design process down to its 2 most basic components. One is empathy for your users and doing user research and trying to understand what are their needs and how are you serving them. And then 2 is, once you have some solutions and some ideas that you want to take action against, prototyping and testing those things as quickly as possible. So if we're talking about the unmistakable creative, then the question would be, how can you first understand what your listeners are trying to achieve by listening to the podcast? And how can you design the podcast to better serve their needs, as well as the other ways that you're engaging them? Are you really satisfying their needs across the board? That would be one big question. And then once you have some solutions there, how can you test those out in lightweight ways?
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's get to sort of this idea of purpose. Actually, you know what? I have to ask you one other question before we get into the notion of purpose. And this is something I read in your bio, that you have a patent for some sort of frozen novelty dessert.
Yeah, it's kind of terrible. But this is my father being an incredible person. I had a whole series of ideas as a kid for things that I would just dream up, inventions and these sorts of things. And my dad was so smitten with one of the ideas that he actually went and got a design patent on it. So I have a patent for a product called chili chips, which is marrying the idea of chips and salsa with soft serve and waffle cones. It's probably the most ridiculous thing you can have a patent on.
And have many people tried it?
It was active in a couple of restaurants in Albuquerque. I don't think that it really spread beyond there as far as I last tracked it. And I believe it's set to expire in the next year or two.
Okay. Wow. All right.
Yeah. Not a wild success story, but it's always something that I think is fun. Like, let me drop this on here because why the heck not?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about this idea of purpose in quite a bit more depth. I think that, we were talking about it, and you said, you don't just have a purpose at work, but you have a personal one. You potentially have a corporate one. One, how did you discover what yours was? And how do you think that ties to IDEO and all the things that you guys do? And then I think the other question that comes from that is, how do other people figure out what theirs is, both in a professional and a personal context?
Yeah, so I think that the answer for how did I find it myself is exactly the same way that we apply it in the Power of Purpose course, in the way that we do in our work at IDEO too, which is number one, how do you look back to your proudest moments of your past and say, in those proudest moments, what were you doing? And who were the people who were benefiting from the work that you were doing? And what was the impact that you were having on their lives? Because once you have those two ingredients, who were you serving and what was the impact, you can very quickly flip that around into a simple purpose statement or even a question. Because you can say, how might I create more of this impact for these people? Because once you have a question like that, you can then apply it to your own life and say, what am I doing today that answers that question? And what am I doing today that absolutely does not? And that then raises a question of based on that, what should you start, what should you stop, and what should you continue? So for myself, I had a very similar experience of looking at the work that I've been doing and saying, what really gets me excited? When I look back on the projects that we've taken on, clients we've worked with, and when I look at what I might want to do in the future, I have to start asking that question of what were my proudest moments? And all of my proudest moments point to these times where it wasn't just about designing a cool solution, but it was actually working with a team or with a company and seeing a dramatic cultural change, where you saw a different kind of conversation happening with these warm, kind companies being developed and teams being developed. And that's what really gets me excited. And so then the question becomes, how can I do more of that? And that leads to the portfolio of work that I take on these days.
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the Irobot Roomba robot vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from Irobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable. Okay. If you were to walk me through that, what would that look like if we were talking about this in the context of Unmistakable Creative?
So if I were to ask you, if I were to help you try and uncover what your purpose is?
Yeah.
So, I would start very simply with having you pull out a piece of paper, because it's very hard to sort of talk it out loud.
Sure.
Pull out a sheet of paper and try and jot down for yourself, what are some of your proudest moments? If you were to look at your professional career, and we're looking at a professional purpose, then what are your proudest moments at work? And to jot a few of those down. And then once you've done that, to then take the next step and take a separate sheet of paper, or we're addicted to Post-its, use a separate Post-it, and write out who was the person or the group of people that you were serving in doing that work and doing that thing.
Uh-huh.
Then on a third sheet of paper or a third Post-it, start writing out, what was the impact that you had on those people? How did they benefit from the work that you did? And that's how you get to that really simple, how might we question, or the simple purpose statement, which would be, I exist to create blank impact for blank people.
Mm-hmm.
It's poetry. It's not beautiful, but it's enough to get you there.
Yeah, no doubt. What have you seen has been the impact of organizations and individuals who discover this in the people that have gone through this, both as individuals and organizations with you guys?
Yeah, what I find is really amazing in doing this work and in talking about purpose is that it starts people having conversations they never would have had before. So 2 weeks ago, I was in a conference room with the executive board of a CPG company, a packaged goods company, and they were having a conversation about removing or reducing waste in their packaging and saying, how can we make all of our packaging either recyclable or how can we strip it down to its absolute bare minimum? Because we realize that what we're doing in this company and the impact that we want to have on the world is not to create more waste and to harm the environment. And that's a conversation they never would have had because it has so many cost implications potentially looped up in it. Conversation they never would have had if they'd not been talking about what's their purpose and how can they activate it with their people.
Mm-hmm. Where have you seen this applied in the IDEO culture? And what does your own hiring process look like in relation to this? Because it always seems to me, I think I told my business partner once, there's probably one place on the planet where I might even consider the possibility of a job. IDEO is kind of number one on that list.
Nice. Yeah. So, I mean, it pops up in so many ways inside of IDEO. I think the strongest way, if I look at our hiring and our recruiting, would actually be, we have a question for ourselves of how can we create impact through design? Or really, how can we create disproportionate impact? And that's a question that we're always asking. But if we're to look at how does this pop up in culture more broadly, I love going back to the original history of IDEO, which David Kelly founded this company in the late 70s because he wanted a place where he could work every day with his friends. And so there's this question that we think about when we look at recruiting and we look at people that we might hire, which isn't about are we looking for cultural fit, for people that we can hang out with who could be our buddies. Mm-hmm. We're actually looking at a question instead of cultural add. What do you bring to the group that makes us all better because you're here and you're part of it? Mm-hmm. And that's what we're really looking at. What could be the disproportionate impact of bringing this new person on? And so that often is a phrase, disproportionate impact. It's a little clunky that we throw around here quite a bit in trying to think about what do we do and who do we want to become.
And I mean, you guys have brought in people from like every background imaginable. I know because we've had El Luna here as a guest. I know she used to work for you guys, and it doesn't seem like there's any mold necessarily.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. We look to solve. We find that people often get more creative when they have different sources of input. There's a lot of research into creativity that finds that the act of coming up with new ideas is usually one of connecting disparate thoughts in your mind. And so at IDEO, what we're often doing is trying to pull together team members who have radically different backgrounds so that they can provoke each other to come up with startling new ideas. Mm-hmm. So that brings us up to hire food scientists and data scientists and material scientists and those sorts of folks, as well as classic industrial designers, interaction designers, graphic designers, et cetera.
Uh-huh. What do your own day-to-day sort of creative habits and rituals and routines look like, and how does that impact your work? Is that something that's part of the culture for a lot of people for you guys?
What are my day-to-day habits? It's funny. I don't think I have a single day that is ever the same. I doubt rarely that many people do. But what are my daily habits that start to connect with this? I find that what I do more than anything else is I try and capture in every conversation that I'm in something in a drawing, because there's something about bringing art into whatever I'm doing that both translates the conversation to something that people will remember, but also helps to anchor what we're doing and anchor the conversation on a new framework or even just a funny cartoon to help us remember what we're doing.
So one other thing that I want to spend a bit of time talking about is this notion of creative confidence, because that's what caused me to reach out to you guys. I mean, so many of the things in that book it's funny because in so many ways I felt like I was reading the trajectory of my own creative career in that book. And I'm curious, one, in your experience, how have you seen people build creative confidence in the environment that you guys are in the organizations that you work with, and how does that tie to purpose?
Yeah, the notion of creative confidence is actually, it's largely what IDEO is anchored on, and it's how we take our prototyping approach, which is you can always try anything in a safe way. There's always some way to test out your ideas before you fully commit, and that's what helps us adopt this learning posture. of saying we don't need to have all the answers. We know that we can make small mistakes and still find the right solution. And that's what helps us lean into challenges that we never would have thought of taking on before. So it makes us more and more audacious. We have a studio that was recently launched inside of Dubai that was really a question of how can we transform the impression of the United Arab Emirates into, instead of having a conversation around, say, Islam and extremism and anything else, how can we instead have a conversation around generosity? And that's a really audacious question that is amazing. And so how can we begin to lean into that? The way that we do that is really by saying, what are the small creative steps that we can take to bring people together or closer together? Mm-hmm. And so we try and say, how can we take always these small bets, these baby steps, to try something out before we lean into it full steam.
So how do other people develop that sort of capacity for experimentation and iteration? I mean, it sounds like that's a huge part of what you guys do to get to the results that you produce.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just through experience. I mean, we try and create as many opportunities to share what we do and our approaches with the world. So that's what sparked us to found IDEO, which is an online learning platform for anybody to learn how to solve problems creatively, but also led us to do things like publish the Human-Centered Design Toolkit, which I think is now called Design Kit, which is free online for anybody to take on. But we also just try and give away our methods. I mean, we essentially give away our process and give away all of our special sauce, knowing that it's not about how you do it that makes IDEO special. Mm-hmm. And we want more people to be empowered to take action the same way that we do.
Yeah. Well, let's talk specifically about the course that I know you guys have coming up, which is all about this idea of purpose. I'd love to talk about sort of the material that's in it, what people can expect, and, why you think they should take it.
Yeah, so the course that we built out is called The Power of Purpose, and I will give you a web plug, which is it's at IDEOU.com/purpose. But the whole idea for the class was we had built out a course called Designing for Change. And this is a class that captured a lot of what our studio does in helping leaders take on massive changes in their organizations, whether you're at the senior leadership position or not. But when you talk about change and you talk about new things developing inside the company, there's always a question of what stays the same. And so in that course, we talked a lot about purpose. And so it led a question of a class around purpose being our most requested course. And so we built one out with all of our playbook for how you can define purpose and not just come up with a catchy slogan, but actually make it come alive in the team that you work in, regardless, or for your own self, regardless of whether you have power or authority over a large group. Mm-hmm. And so in the class, what we're doing is walking through how do you define a purpose, how do you start to make it come to life for people, and how do you give them an opportunity to take control over that and make it work for themselves as well.
Yeah. And now, is this something that can be applied in both an organizational and an individual context? Meaning, let's say somebody is like a freelancer or an artist. Does it apply the same way to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's so much great research out there about the power of having meaning in your personal life. Mm-hmm. I will spit some numbers at you really quickly, but my favorite factoid around purpose is that there was a study done 2 years ago finding that people with a sense of meaning in their lives have a 15% lower risk of death, regardless of what age they are, whether they're in their 20s or their 50s or their 70s. If you have a sense of meaning in your life, you're at a lower risk of fatality than somebody else. On top of that, we find that if you look at a professional context, whatever your job might be, that people with a sense of purpose are 64% more fulfilled in the jobs that they do. So it doesn't matter if your company has a purpose. If you have one for yourself, you're more likely to feel activated and engaged in what you do.
Yeah.
And companies and teams with purpose have a 40% higher retention rate of their employees. And then I can go into actual revenue numbers, but I will save you. I will save you the business casing. But those are my favorite numbers. So if you're looking at, it doesn't matter what you do. You're an artist, you're a musician, you're a waiter in a restaurant. It doesn't matter. If you can define purpose for yourself, it has transformative impact on your life.
I think that this will kind of bring us full circle, but it doesn't sound like work is the only place where this exists, and it's not necessarily that we have to find what purpose is through work.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who they do their job so that they can go and do what they love. Job is just a gateway to that. I think that's absolutely true. Now, that being said, it's never I don't think it's ever incumbent on any given job or leader or manager to create purpose for you. Often on you to try and find, how do I find meaning in the work that I do? There was a Yale researcher I find very inspiring, whose name I will always slaughter. So her name is Amy Wyszynski.
Okay.
So, yeah, don't try and say that one. But Amy Wyszynski is a Yale researcher who did this study with hospital workers where she was curious what keeps people engaged when they have really tough jobs. And so she thought, who has the toughest job of anybody I can imagine? And she thought, well, people who are maintenance workers or janitors at hospitals. And so she went and studied them, and she started asking people, what do you do? What's your job? What actions do you take on a daily basis? And we just sort of interviewed people about what inspires them or motivates them to do their work. And she saw a really interesting trend. There seemed to be two groups of people that she talked to. One group were people where you say, what do you do? And they would say, well, I come here and I fix things and I clean up really dirty messes like blood and bodily fluids and other gross stuff. And the other group of people that she would talk to, she'd say, what do you do here? And they would say, well, I'm a healer, or I'm an ambassador for the hospital. And she'd say, well, or what do you do to actually make that? What makes you an ambassador? Or what makes you a healer? And they would say, well, when I'm working in the intensive care unit, I actually use gentler cleaning products because I don't want harsh chemicals and harsh smells to harm people's recoveries. Or another person that she talked to worked in a coma ward and would switch out paintings from one patient's room to another and cycle them through so that these comatose patients would have a more stimulating environment in the hopes that would help them recover faster. So really kind of amazing stuff. And then she started looking at performance metrics behind that. These people who she called job crafters, who are taking the job and making it their own and finding their own meaning in it. And she found that people who are job crafting, they scored 8 points higher in terms of their overall performance, which is not a huge number, but it was enough to be statistically significant. But what was more interesting was that they were 3 times more engaged in the work that they did. And they suffered half the risk of burnout than the average worker. And so there's something really amazing in there. If you can find purpose and define meaning for yourself, no matter what your job is, it can have huge benefit to your life.
Yeah. So 2 final questions for you. Has your definition of purpose changed with age, and has your definition of success changed with age?
That's interesting. I don't think my sense of purpose has dramatically shifted over the course of my career. I mean, I'm definitely not someone who at 18 knew exactly what I wanted to do. All I knew was that I needed some kind of college degree, and then I would go and figure things out. And I think all I've done over the course of my career is try and figure out more and more what that is. And so I think wanting to, when I was at a young age, have a general positive impact on the world was definitely part of it. But over time, that's shaped and narrowed a little bit, and I feel much more targeted and focused on what I want to do now.
Mm-hmm. And what about your definition of success?
Definition of success. Honestly, my definition of success is probably only exists in 3-month chunks, and it's really very short term. Am I kicking ass in the work that I'm doing? And I think that's probably my core definition of success right now. Other than that, I feel pretty active and engaged in the work that I get to do, and I feel very blessed to be where I am.
Very cool. Well, I have one last question for you, which is how we finish all of our interviews at the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
What makes something unmistakable? That makes me want to know, what does mistakable mean? Well, what makes something unmistakable? I'm sorry, I have to pause on it for a second because I'm really wrestling with So I would say the nature of being mistakable is being something that you can either forget or ignore. So you have a question about how can you stand out? And I think there's no better way to stand out than to find where your passion lies and to make that come to life and share it with others. I find that the people who tell the best stories and the people who build the best designs at IDEO are always the people who are most engaged and excited in the work that they do. So what makes someone unmistakable, what I would say, is the sparkle in their eyes when they talk about what they're doing.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and share your story and your insights with our listeners. This has been phenomenal, and you've packed it with a lot of nuggets. Where can people find out more about you, your work, and everything that you're up to?
Yeah, people can check out the class that we are now offering called The Power of Purpose on IDEOU. It's IDEOU.com/purpose, or learn more about IDEO at IDEO.com.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.